Commander Zethkar had witnessed the fall of 17 civilizations. He had seen mighty fleets reduced to cosmic dust and proud species bend their knees in surrender. For 3 centuries, he had served the hegemony as their most decorated war strategist, believing he had mastered every possible form of warfare the galaxy could offer. Then, humanity entered the war. What followed wasn't just a military campaign, it was a complete redefinition of what warfare could become. The humans didn't just fight, they transformed conflict itself into something unrecognizable, something that made even the most hardened veterans of 1,000 battles question everything they thought they knew about war. This is the story of how a species that had barely reached the stars taught an ancient galactic empire that there are depths to warfare that no civilization should ever have to discover, and why some knowledge comes at a price too terrible to calculate. Commander Zethkar stood before the massive tactical display in the war room of the hegemony flagship Eternal Dominion. The holographic projection showed a 3-dimensional map of the Outer Rim territories, where small red dots marked the positions of human settlements. Each dot represented what the hegemony considered a minor nuisance, primitive colonies of a species that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. The hegemony had been the undisputed rulers of this galaxy for over 2,000 years. Their military doctrine had been refined through countless conflicts, each victory adding another layer to their understanding of warfare. Zethkar himself had served for 3 centuries, rising through the ranks by applying the tried and true principles that had never failed them: overwhelming force, superior technology, and the psychological pressure of inevitable defeat. "The humans have rejected our final ultimatum," reported Sub-Commander Velvar, his scaled hide shifting to a nervous purple color. "They refuse to accept integration into the hegemony." Zethkar's 4 eyes studied the display with practiced calm. In his experience, newly spacefaring species always went through the same predictable stages when faced with hegemony expansion. First came denial, the belief that their primitive weapons could somehow stand against technology thousands of years more advanced. Then came desperate alliance seeking, as they reached out to other species who had already learned the futility of resistance. Finally, came acceptance, usually after a single demonstration of hegemony firepower reduced one of their worlds to glass. "How many ships do they possess?" Zethkar asked, his translator rendering his clicking speech into standard hegemony. "Intelligence estimates approximately 2,000 vessels across all their settlements," Velvar replied. "Mostly converted civilian craft with basic defensive armaments. Nothing that registers above Class 3 threat levels." The numbers were laughably small. Zethkar's current battle group alone contained 5,000 ships, each one capable of obliterating entire fleets of human vessels. The technology gap was so vast that it bordered on the absurd. Human weapons couldn't even penetrate hegemony shields, while a single shot from a hegemony destroyer could crack a planet's crust. What about their ground forces? Zethkar continued his standard assessment. Primitive ballistic weapons and basic energy shields. No powered armor, no plasma weapons, no neural disruptors. They still use chemical propulsion for most of their vehicles. Velvar's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Our intelligence division classified them as technologically infantile in their latest report." Zethkar nodded, filing away the information in the same mental framework he had used for hundreds of similar campaigns. The humans fit perfectly into the category of minor expansion resistance species who possess just enough technology to make them think they could fight back, but not enough to pose any real threat. "Initiate Standard Pacification Protocol 7, he ordered. Single fleet demonstration at their primary world, followed by a 48-hour surrender deadline. If they remain non-compliant, we proceed with systematic infrastructure elimination until compliance is achieved." It was the same approach that had worked against the Kalari resistance 15 years ago, and the Vortak alliance before that. Show overwhelming force, give them time to understand their hopeless position, then gradually increase pressure until rational thought overcame primitive pride. The protocol had a 97% success rate. 3 days later, Admiral Thexmore led a demonstration fleet of 300 ships to Earth's solar system. The plan was elegantly simple: emerge from hyperspace at the edge of the system, destroy a few military installations with minimal civilian casualties, then transmit surrender terms. The humans would see ships that could reshape continents with a single volley, realize their position was hopeless, and accept integration like every other species before them. Zethkar monitored the operation from his command center, expecting nothing more than routine reports of successful intimidation. Instead, the first transmission he received from Admiral Thexmore carried an undercurrent of confusion that was highly unusual for a veteran fleet commander. "Initial phase completed as planned," Thexmore reported. We eliminated 3 of their orbital installations and disabled their primary defensive platforms. However, their response has been unexpected. Explain, Zethkar commanded. They didn't attempt to flee or establish communication channels for surrender negotiations. Instead, they've begun evacuating their civilian populations to underground facilities while their remaining military assets have taken defensive positions around the planet. Our tactical analysis indicates they're preparing for a prolonged siege. Zethkar frowned. Extended resistance wasn't unprecedented, but it usually only occurred among species with some hope of outside assistance or secret weapons. The humans had neither. Their isolation in the outer rim meant no other species would risk hegemony displeasure to aid them, and their technology was centuries behind anything that could threaten hegemony forces. Perhaps they simply need more time to process the reality of their situation, Zethkar suggested. Maintain position and continue transmitting surrender terms. Begin targeting non-essential infrastructure to demonstrate our capability without causing excessive casualties. Over the following week, Admiral Thexmore's fleet systematically destroyed human manufacturing centers, communications arrays, and transportation hubs. Each strike was carefully calculated to demonstrate overwhelming superiority while avoiding major population centers. It was psychological warfare at its most refined, applying just enough pressure to break morale without triggering the kind of desperate fanaticism that sometimes prolonged conflicts unnecessarily. But the humans continue to fortify their positions. Their behavior remains irrational, Thexmore reported during his next scheduled transmission. We've eliminated 60% of their industrial capacity and severed communications between their major population centers. Any reasonable species would have opened surrender negotiations by now. What about their military response? Zethkar asked. Minimal. They've launched several small raids against our perimeter, but nothing that posed any real threat. Their ships are destroyed before they can get within effective weapon range. It's almost like they're testing our defenses rather than attempting serious attacks. Zethkar found this information puzzling. Testing enemy defenses suggested they were planning some kind of counterattack, but what could a species with inferior technology possibly be planning? Every scan of their remaining ships showed the same primitive weapons and defensive systems. There were no hidden technological surprises, no secret alliances, no indication of anything that could threaten a hegemony fleet. Perhaps they're simply inexperienced with interstellar warfare, Veldar suggested when Zethkar discussed the situation with his senior staff. Many primitive species have difficulty grasping the scale of galactic conflict. They might believe their home system represents their entire territory rather than understanding they're facing an empire that spans thousands of worlds. It was a reasonable explanation. Newly spacefaring species often suffered from what xenopsychologists called scale blindness, the inability to comprehend the vast scope of galactic civilization when their own experience was limited to a single star system. Perhaps the humans simply didn't understand that the demonstration fleet represented a tiny fraction of hegemony military power. Transmit detailed information about hegemony territorial extent and military capabilities, Zethkar ordered. Include historical records of successful pacification campaigns. Sometimes primitive species need to see the full scope of what they're facing before rational thought can overcome emotional responses. The transmission included visual records of a dozen different worlds where hegemony forces had demonstrated their power. Planets where mountains had been relocated with single weapon discharges. Star systems where entire asteroid fields had been rearranged to suit hegemony needs. The technological demonstrations weren't meant as threats, but as educational material to help the humans understand the futility of resistance. 3 hours after the transmission was sent, the humans finally responded. But their response wasn't a surrender offer. Instead, every remaining human ship in the system began moving toward Admiral Thexmore's fleet. Not in the scattered, desperate charges that characterized the death throes of defeated species, but in carefully coordinated formations that suggested tactical planning rather than suicidal desperation. Admiral Thexmore's voice carried genuine bewilderment. For the first time in his long career, they appear to be launching a full-scale attack. Zethkar stared at the tactical display in disbelief. The humans had perhaps 40 ships remaining in their home system, facing a hegemony fleet of 300 vessels. The technological disparity meant that each hegemony ship was worth at least 20 human vessels in combat effectiveness. The humans were effectively attacking with a force that was outnumbered 15-1 and outgunned by factors that made meaningful resistance impossible. Perhaps it's a ceremonial gesture, suggested Veldar. Some species prefer to die fighting rather than accept subjugation. A final display of defiance before inevitable defeat. But, as Zethkar watched the human ships maneuver, he noticed something that made him profoundly uneasy. Their movements weren't driven by desperate heroism or suicidal honor. Instead, they moved with the kind of calculated precision that suggested they actually believed they could win. The thought was absurd, but it nagged at him as he watched the two fleets close the distance between them. No species in galactic history had ever displayed this kind of confidence when facing such overwhelming odds unless they possessed some advantage that wasn't immediately apparent. Admiral Thexmore, Zethkar transmitted, exercise maximum caution during the engagement. Scan continuously for any technological surprises or hidden weapons. Something about this situation doesn't follow standard patterns. As he spoke, the first human ships came within range of the hegemony fleet's defensive perimeter. What happened next would challenge everything Zethkar thought he knew about warfare, and begin his education in the depths of human capability that no civilized species should ever have to explore. The human ships didn't slow down as they approached weapon range. Instead, they accelerated directly into the teeth of the hegemony defensive fire. Ships were destroyed by the dozens as concentrated plasma beams and graviton torpedoes found their targets, but the remaining vessels continued their advance without deviation or hesitation. Zethkar had seen desperate charges before, but never with such mechanical precision. The humans weren't driven by emotion or honor, they were executing a plan that required them to accept massive casualties as an acceptable cost of achieving some objective he couldn't identify. As the first human ships reached close combat range, they suddenly changed their attack pattern in a way that defied every principle of rational military doctrine. Instead of targeting the largest threats or attempting to disable key systems, they began ramming hegemony vessels at maximum velocity. The impacts barely scratched the shields of the hegemony ships, but they created something Zethkar had never seen in 3 centuries of warfare: chaos in a perfectly ordered hegemony formation. Ships had to maneuver to avoid collisions, breaking their defensive patterns and creating gaps in their overlapping fields of fire. And, in those gaps, more human ships poured through. Admiral Thexmore's voice carried the first hint of concern. Their tactics are completely irrational, but they're forcing us into reactive maneuvers. They're not trying to win, they're trying to create disorder. Zethkar watched the tactical display with growing unease. The humans were sacrificing ships at a rate that should have broken any sane military force, but each sacrifice served a specific purpose. They were mapping hegemony response patterns, identifying weak points in formations, and forcing the superior fleet to fight in close quarters where superior technology counted for less than positioning and timing. But none of it should have mattered. The hegemony fleet still possessed overwhelming advantages in every category that determined combat effectiveness. The humans were learning about hegemony tactics, but that knowledge should have been useless against such superior forces. Then, Admiral Thexmore transmitted a report that made Zethkar question everything he thought he understood about the nature of warfare itself. "Commander, we've destroyed 37 human vessels with no losses on our side, but something unprecedented is happening. The remaining human ships aren't retreating or showing any signs of demoralization. Instead, their attack coordination is improving with each engagement." Zethkar's blood ran cold as the implications hit him. The humans weren't just accepting massive casualties, they were learning from them. Each ship they lost taught them something new about hegemony capabilities and weaknesses. They were treating the battle like an experiment, with their own lives as the acceptable cost of gathering data. What kind of species approached warfare as a learning opportunity rather than a contest for survival? What level of collective determination allowed them to watch their fellows die while calmly analyzing the tactical lessons to be gained from each death? As he watched the battle continue, Zethkar began to realize that he might be witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans weren't just fighting a hopeless battle, they were conducting the most expensive intelligence-gathering operation he had ever seen. And if they were willing to pay such a price to learn about hegemony capabilities, it could only mean they believed that knowledge would eventually be worth more than the ships and lives they were spending to acquire it. The battle above Earth lasted 18 hours. When it ended, Admiral Thexmore's fleet remained intact while every human ship had been destroyed. By any conventional measure, it had been a complete hegemony victory. 0 losses against total enemy annihilation was the kind of result that military academies used as examples of perfect tactical execution. Yet Commander Zethkar felt no satisfaction as he reviewed the battle reports. Something fundamental had changed during those 18 hours, though he couldn't articulate exactly what it was. The humans had lost every ship, but their behavior throughout the engagement had been so far outside normal parameters that it challenged basic assumptions about rational military conduct. The survivors have retreated to their underground facilities, Admiral Thexmore reported. Orbital scans indicate massive tunnel systems beneath every major population center. They appear to have been preparing for siege warfare long before we arrived. This was another anomaly that bothered Zethkar. Most species didn't begin serious military preparations until after first contact with the hegemony. The humans had been building extensive defensive infrastructure while they were still confined to their home system, suggesting a level of strategic planning that didn't match their primitive technology. What are their fortification capabilities? Zethkar asked. Impressive for their technological level, Thexmore admitted. Deep tunnel networks with multiple redundant entrances, distributed life support systems, and what appears to be substantial stockpiling of supplies. They've essentially transformed their entire planet into a fortress. Zethkar found this troubling. Fortress worlds were extremely difficult to pacify without resorting to total planetary destruction, which the hegemony preferred to avoid. Dead worlds provided no economic value and served as poor examples for other potential resistors. The goal was always conquest rather than extermination. Begin standard siege protocols, he ordered. Cut off all supply lines, establish orbital blockade, and begin systematic destruction of surface infrastructure. When their supplies run low, they'll be forced to negotiate. But, even as he gave the orders, Zethkar couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The humans had displayed too many behaviors that didn't fit established patterns. Their willingness to sacrifice ships for intelligence gathering, their preparation for siege warfare before any threat materialized, and their complete lack of surrender negotiations despite facing impossible odds all suggested a species that approached warfare from fundamentally different assumptions. Over the following weeks, Admiral Thexmore's forces implemented a textbook siege. They destroyed every surface installation, eliminated all communication satellites, and established a perimeter that prevented any ships from reaching the planet. By every historical precedent, the isolated humans should have begun seeking terms within a month. Instead, they went completely silent. No communications, no attempts to break the blockade, no negotiation overtures. The entire planet simply went dark as if its population had vanished. Orbital scans confirmed that life signs still existed in the underground facilities, but there was no activity that suggested preparation for either surrender or breakout attempts. It's possible they're hoping for rescue, suggested Veldar when Zethkar expressed his confusion about the human behavior. Perhaps they believe their other colonies will mount some kind of relief operation. It was a logical theory, but intelligence reports from human colonies throughout the Outer Rim showed no signs of military buildup or alliance formation. If anything, the other human settlements appeared to be reducing their visible activity, almost as if they were trying to avoid hegemony attention rather than preparing to assist their homeworld. 3 months into the siege, Zethkar received a priority transmission that forced him to completely re-evaluate the situation. The message came not from Admiral Thexmore, but from Fleet Commander Coraxtel, who was overseeing routine pacification of human colonies in a system 12 parsecs away. Commander Zethkar, Coraxtel's voice carried an edge of uncertainty that was highly unusual for such an experienced officer. We've encountered some unexpected complications during our expansion into human territory. Explain, Zethkar replied, though he had a growing suspicion that this report would not involve routine complications. We arrived at the Kepler 442 system expecting to find a typical colonial outpost, perhaps a few 100,000 inhabitants with minimal defensive capabilities. Instead, we discovered a population of nearly 50 million humans spread across 4 heavily fortified worlds. Zethkar felt a chill run through his body. Intelligence had estimated total human population at less than 20 billion spread across dozens of worlds. A single system containing 50 million people suggested either massive intelligence failures or rapid population movements that had somehow escaped detection. How could our intelligence be so inaccurate, he asked. That's not the most troubling part, Coraxtel continued. When we demanded their surrender, they responded with a counter-proposal. They offered to provide detailed technical specifications for a new type of faster-than-light drive in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. The implications of this statement hit Zethkar like a physical blow. The humans were claiming to have developed FTL technology superior to hegemony systems, which was impossible. No species had made significant improvements to hyperspace navigation in over 500 years. The physics were too well understood, and the engineering requirements were beyond anything a primitive civilization could achieve. Obviously, their claims are false, Zethkar said, though he heard uncertainty in his own voice. That's what we assumed, Coraxtel replied. However, they provided preliminary calculations that our physics team couldn't immediately dismiss. The mathematical framework appears sound, even if the practical applications are unproven. Zethkar stared at his communication display in disbelief. The idea that humans could contribute anything useful to hegemony technology was absurd, but Fleet Commander Coraxtel wouldn't mention it if his science teams hadn't found something genuinely interesting. What kind of improvements are they claiming? He asked. Reduced power requirements by approximately 40%, increased range by a factor of 3, and navigation precision that would allow jumps within planetary gravity wells without destabilizing local spacetime. Coraxtel paused. If these claims are accurate, it would revolutionize interstellar travel. The specifications were impressive, but Zethkar remained skeptical. Species under military pressure often made grandiose claims about secret technologies, hoping to buy time or extract concessions. It was a common psychological response to hopeless situations. Have they provided any proof of these capabilities? He asked. They've offered to demonstrate the technology on a small scale, but only after we agree to withdraw our forces to the edge of the system and establish formal negotiation protocols. Zethkar's tactical instincts immediately rejected this proposal. Withdrawing forces during active operations violated every principle of military pressure maintenance. It would signal weakness and give the humans time to prepare additional defenses or escape attempts. Decline their offer, he ordered. Continue standard pacification procedures. If they possess superior technology, they can demonstrate it while under siege rather than after we've given them operational freedom. But, as he ended the transmission, Zethkar found himself troubled by questions that hadn't existed at the beginning of this campaign. How had human population numbers been so drastically underestimated? Where had they acquired the scientific knowledge to even theoretically improve upon hegemony technology? And why did every encounter with human forces result in behaviors that defied established patterns? His concerns deepened when additional reports began arriving from other sectors. Human colonies throughout the Outer Rim were responding to hegemony expansion with tactics that suggested coordination far beyond what should have been possible for an isolated species. Some colonies evacuated entirely before hegemony forces arrived, leaving behind only automated defensive systems. Others offered technological exchanges similar to what Fleet Commander Coraxtel had encountered. Still others engaged in the same kind of intelligence-gathering combat that had characterized the battle above Earth. The pattern was unprecedented. No species in galactic history had demonstrated such coordinated resistance across multiple star systems without some form of instantaneous communication network. But intelligence scans had detected no such technology among human settlements, and the hegemony's own understanding of physics suggested that real-time communication across interstellar distances was impossible. Sir, Veldar approached with a datapad that contained the latest intelligence summary. We've received concerning reports from 7 different human encounters. They all suggest capabilities that don't match our initial assessments. Zethkar reviewed the data with growing unease. The humans appear to be demonstrating technological innovations, population numbers, and coordination capabilities that were completely inconsistent with initial intelligence estimates. Either every intelligence-gathering operation in human space had suffered massive systemic failures, or the humans possessed capabilities they had successfully concealed until active hostilities began. What's the assessment from our xenopsychology teams? He asked. That's where things become truly puzzling, Veldar replied. The psychological profiles suggest a species with unusual approaches to risk assessment and collective decision-making. They appear to place much lower value on individual survival than most species, but much higher value on long-term group survival. It's as if their entire strategic framework is based on assumptions we don't share. This observation resonated with Zethkar's own growing concerns. Every human action seemed calculated to provide advantages for their species as a whole, even when individual communities suffered devastating losses. It was the kind of thinking that suggested either primitive irrationality or sophisticated strategic planning that operated on timescales longer than typical military campaigns. How long before the siege of Earth forces surrender negotiations? He asked. Admiral Fexmore estimates another 3 to 6 months, assuming standard psychological pressure timelines, Veldar replied. However, he's noted that the humans aren't displaying normal stress indicators. Their underground facilities appear to be operating with remarkable efficiency despite the siege conditions. 6 months was longer than most species could sustain siege resistance, but it wasn't unprecedented. What troubled Zethkar was the implication that the humans might be planning something during those 6 months rather than simply waiting for their supplies to run out. That evening, as he reviewed tactical projections in his private quarters, Zethkar received an encrypted communication that changed everything he thought he understood about the human threat level. The message came from High Command, marked with priority codes reserved for strategic threats to hegemony security. As he decrypted the contents, Zethkar realized that human activities had attracted attention at the highest levels of imperial authority. Commander Zethkar, the recorded message began with the distinctive voice of Grand Admiral Vexthra, the supreme military authority of the hegemony. Recent intelligence indicates that the human situation may represent a more significant challenge than initially assessed. You are hereby granted emergency authorization to employ any resources necessary to resolve this situation rapidly. The authorization was unprecedented. Emergency powers were only granted when threats approached the level of empire-threatening crises. The fact that Grand Admiral Vexthra was personally involved suggested that human activities had implications far beyond a simple expansion campaign. Intelligence networks throughout the galaxy have detected unusual patterns of activity that appear to be connected to human operations, the message continued. Species that have never shown interest in military affairs are beginning to ask questions about hegemony expansion policies. Several client states have requested explanations for our activities in human space. Most concerning, there are indications that some species may be establishing independent communication channels with human colonies. Zethkar felt his blood freeze as he processed this information. The hegemony's control over its vast empire depended on preventing communication and coordination between client species. If the humans were somehow inspiring other species to question hegemony authority or establish independent diplomatic relations, it could threaten the fundamental structure of imperial control. Your new orders are to end human resistance within 30 standard days, using whatever methods are necessary, the Grand Admiral concluded. The situation must be resolved before it has time to metastasize into something that threatens galactic stability. As the message ended, Zethkar sat in his command chair and stared out at the stars. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never encountered a situation that escalated from routine pacification to empire-threatening crisis in a matter of months. The humans had somehow transformed a simple expansion campaign into something that worried the highest levels of hegemony leadership. But, as he began planning the escalated operations that would end human resistance within 30 days, Zethkar couldn't shake the feeling that he was still missing something fundamental about human capabilities. Every action they had taken seemed designed to achieve objectives he couldn't identify, using methods that defied conventional military logic. What if their apparent willingness to sacrifice everything wasn't desperate resistance, but the opening phase of a strategy that operated on a scale he had never encountered before? What if the humans understood something about warfare that the hegemony, in all its centuries of dominance, had never been forced to learn? The possibility terrified him more than any enemy fleet he had ever faced. Commander Zethkar stood before the largest fleet assembly in hegemony history. 15,000 ships from across the galaxy had been pulled from their regular duties and consolidated into a single massive armada. The sight should have filled him with confidence. No force in galactic history had ever resisted such overwhelming military power. Instead, he felt a growing sense of unease that had been building since he received his emergency orders from Grand Admiral Vexthra. The very fact that such a fleet had been deemed necessary to deal with a primitive human resistance suggested that the situation had evolved far beyond anything in his experience. Final intelligence briefing, Commander, reported Senior Analyst Mekthor, approaching with the latest comprehensive assessment of human capabilities. Our expanded reconnaissance operations have provided disturbing insights into the scope of human preparations. Zethkar accepted the data tablet with reluctance. Each new piece of intelligence about human activities had consistently challenged previous assumptions, and he had learned to expect the unexpected when it came to these reports. Human population estimates have been revised upward by a factor of 10, Mekthor began. Current projections suggest approximately 200 billion humans distributed across nearly 300 star systems. The numbers hit Zethkar like a physical blow. 200 billion people represented a population larger than most established galactic civilizations. The idea that such numbers could have existed in the outer rim without detection suggested intelligence failures so massive they bordered on the impossible. How could our estimates have been so inaccurate, he asked. It appears that human expansion followed patterns we've never encountered before, Mekthor explained. Instead of establishing large, visible colonies on suitable worlds, they've been creating extensive underground and asteroid-based settlements that are nearly invisible to standard reconnaissance. Many of their worlds are actually distributed networks of hidden installations throughout entire star systems. Zethkar studied the revised stellar maps with growing concern. The human presence wasn't confined to a few dozen primitive colonies as originally believed. Instead, they had quietly established a distributed civilization that spanned a significant portion of the outer rim. The scale of concealed construction required to achieve such expansion suggested technological and organizational capabilities far beyond what any intelligence assessment had indicated. What about their military resources? He asked. This is where the situation becomes truly alarming, Mekthor replied. Recent encounters suggest they possess approximately 50,000 ships, not the 2,000 we initially estimated. However, their tactical doctrine remains completely unlike anything in our databases. 50,000 ships still represented a significant numerical disadvantage against the current hegemony fleet, but the psychological impact of such dramatically revised estimates was troubling. If human ship numbers had been underestimated by a factor of 25, what other capabilities might have been completely missed? Explain their tactical doctrine, Zethkar ordered. They appear to view individual battles as components of much larger strategic operations. Instead of seeking to win specific engagements, they focus on gathering intelligence, testing enemy capabilities, and creating conditions for future operations. It's as if every battle is a learning exercise designed to improve their effectiveness in subsequent encounters. This analysis confirms Zethkar's growing suspicions about human strategic thinking. No other species in galactic history had approached warfare as an educational process rather than a contest for immediate victory. The implications were deeply disturbing for a military force accustomed to decisive engagements with clear outcomes. Has there been any evidence of the advanced technologies they've claimed to possess? He asked. Multiple instances, Mekthor replied grimly. Fleet Commander Koraxtel reported that human ships in the Kepler 442 system demonstrated FTL capabilities approximately 30% more efficient than our own. Additionally, 3 other encounters have involved human weapons that penetrated hegemony shields previously considered impenetrable by primitive technology. Zethkar felt his certainty about technological superiority beginning to crumble. The hegemony's dominance had always been based on the assumption that their technology represented the pinnacle of galactic development. If humans could improve upon technologies that had been refined over thousands of years, it suggested either revolutionary scientific breakthroughs or access to knowledge sources that defied explanation. How are they achieving these improvements? He asked. Our science teams believe they're using fundamentally different approaches to technology development, Mekthor explained. Where we refine existing systems incrementally, humans appear to completely reconceptualize basic principles. They're not improving our technology, they're creating entirely new categories of solutions to the same problems. The distinction was subtle but profound. Incremental improvements could be predicted and countered with existing defensive measures. Revolutionary approaches created situations where established military doctrine might be completely inadequate to address new capabilities. What about their psychological profiles? Zethkar asked. Are we any closer to understanding their resistance motivations? This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of our intelligence gathering, Mekthor replied. Humans appear to operate under collective decision-making processes that prioritize long-term species survival over short-term individual or community welfare. They're willing to accept massive casualties if those losses contribute to eventual strategic advantages. Zethkar had observed this pattern repeatedly, but hearing it articulated as formal doctrine made it even more disturbing. Most species could be broken through sufficient pressure because their survival instincts eventually overcame their resistance motivations. But humans seem to view individual survival as subordinate to collective goals that operated on timescales beyond normal military planning. How long-term are their strategic perspectives? He asked. Intelligence suggests they're planning for scenarios decades or even centuries into the future. Their current resistance appears to be designed not to achieve immediate victory, but to establish conditions that will benefit human civilization regardless of short-term outcomes. This revelation forced Zethkar to completely reconsider the nature of the conflict he was facing. If humans were willing to sacrifice entire generations to achieve strategic objectives that wouldn't be realized for centuries, then conventional military pressure might be completely ineffective against their resistance. Sir, interrupted Communications Officer Dexbar, we're receiving a priority transmission from Fleet Admiral Thexmore at Earth. Zethkar accepted the transmission with resignation. Every report from the siege of Earth had brought news of human behaviors that defied conventional military logic. Commander, Thexmore's voice carried exhaustion and confusion. The siege situation has developed in ways that challenge our understanding of defensive warfare. Explain, Zethkar replied, though he suspected the explanation would add to his growing list of human impossibilities. The humans have not only survived 6 months of complete orbital blockade, but their underground facilities appear to be expanding. Seismic monitoring indicates massive construction projects taking place beneath the planet's surface. They're not waiting for relief or hoping for negotiated surrender, they're building something. The implications were staggering. Species under siege typically focused all available resources on immediate survival needs. The idea that humans were conducting major construction projects while completely cut off from external support suggested either hidden resource stockpiles or technological capabilities that violated basic assumptions about closed-system economics. What kind of construction? Zethkar asked. Unknown, but the scale is unprecedented. The energy signatures suggest industrial facilities larger than anything in our databases. Whatever they're building, it requires power generation capabilities that should be impossible for a besieged population. Zethkar closed his eyes and tried to process information that consistently defied logical analysis. Every piece of data about human activities suggested capabilities that shouldn't exist, behaviors that violated established psychological patterns, and strategic thinking that operated on scales no other species had ever demonstrated. Admiral, he said finally, prepare for immediate tactical withdrawal from Earth orbit. Sir? Thexmore's voice carried surprise. Our siege operations are proceeding according to standard protocols. There's no indication of immediate threat to fleet security. Execute withdrawal to minimum safe distance and maintain observation protocols only, Zethkar ordered. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to interfere with human surface operations. As he ended the transmission, Zethkar realized he had just violated everything he had been taught about siege warfare. Withdrawing pressure during successful containment operations was considered one of the gravest tactical errors possible. But his instincts were screaming warnings about a situation that had gone far beyond conventional military parameters. Sir, Veldar approached with obvious concern, withdrawing from Earth will send signals of weakness throughout the fleet. Morale implications could be severe. The morale implications of losing 15,000 ships to an enemy we don't understand would be considerably worse, Zethkar replied. Something is happening on Earth that requires us to completely re-evaluate our approach to human resistance. Over the following days, as reports continued to arrive from human encounters throughout the Outer Rim, Zethkar began to see patterns that suggested a level of coordination impossible for any known technology. Human colonies were responding to hegemony movements with perfect timing, as if they possessed real-time intelligence about operations across hundreds of light-years. Their tactical innovations were being implemented simultaneously by forces that should have had no method of communication. The only logical explanation was that humans possessed communications technology far superior to anything in hegemony arsenals, but every scan and analysis had failed to detect such systems. Either their technology was so advanced that it was invisible to hegemony sensors, or they were using principles of physics that the galaxy's most advanced civilization had never discovered. Commander, Mekthor approached with another intelligence update. We've detected something that may explain human coordination capabilities. Finally, Zethkar replied. What have you discovered? It's not what we've discovered, it's what we've failed to discover, Mekthor explained. Our analysis teams have concluded that human communication methods may not rely on technology at all. Zethkar stared at his intelligence chief with complete incomprehension. Explain that statement. Preliminary evidence suggests that humans may have developed non-technological methods of sharing information across interstellar distances. Biological processes, quantum consciousness effects, or other phenomena that wouldn't register on conventional detection equipment. The suggestion was so far outside established scientific frameworks that Zethkar's first impulse was to dismiss it as impossible speculation. But, given the consistent pattern of human impossibilities, he found himself forced to consider explanations that violated everything he thought he knew about the fundamental nature of reality. Are you suggesting that humans possess psychic abilities? He asked. We're suggesting that humans may have developed capabilities that transcend current understanding of consciousness, communication, and individual identity, Mekthor replied. Their collective decision-making and coordination might represent something entirely outside our experience with sentient species. As Zethkar considered this possibility, he realized that his original confidence in understanding warfare had been based on assumptions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness that might be completely incorrect. If humans possessed capabilities that operated beyond physical laws as the hegemony understood them, then every principle of military strategy might be inadequate to address the threat they represented. The thought that terrified him most was the growing realization that human resistance might not be about winning the current conflict at all. Instead, they might be conducting the largest intelligence gathering and strategic preparation operation in galactic history, using the hegemony's own attacks as a method of learning everything they needed to know about their enemy's capabilities, weaknesses, and strategic assumptions. If that was true, then every hegemony victory was actually contributing to an eventual human advantage that would manifest on timescales beyond current military planning. And if humans were truly capable of the kind of coordination and strategic thinking that his intelligence teams were suggesting, then the hegemony might be facing an enemy unlike anything that had ever existed in the galaxy. Commander Zethkar had been staring at the same intelligence report for 3 hours without truly comprehending its contents. The data was clear, verified by multiple sources, and completely impossible according to everything he understood about military logistics and strategic coordination. 17 separate human colonies across 12 different star systems had simultaneously launched coordinated attacks against hegemony outposts. The timing was precise to within minutes despite the fact that lightspeed communication between the most distant colonies would take months. Each attack had been perfectly calibrated to target specific weaknesses that had only been discovered through previous encounters, suggesting not just communication but shared tactical analysis across impossible distances. But the most disturbing aspect of the coordinated offensive wasn't its impossibility, it was its apparent purpose. The human forces weren't trying to achieve territorial gains or inflict maximum damage. Instead, they were conducting what appeared to be the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation in galactic history, using actual combat as a method of testing hegemony responses under controlled conditions. "Sir," Veldar approached with visible reluctance, "we've received a communication from the humans. They're requesting a formal meeting." Zethkar looked up from the impossible data with surprise. After months of warfare without any attempt at negotiation, the humans had suddenly decided to initiate diplomatic contact. The timing, coming immediately after their coordinated offensive, suggested strategic calculation rather than desperation. "What are their terms?" he asked. "They're not proposing terms," Veldar replied. "They're offering to share information. According to their message, they believe we've been operating under incorrect assumptions about the nature of this conflict." The suggestion that humans might possess superior understanding of the situation was both insulting and terrifying. Zethkar's entire strategic framework was based on the assumption that hegemony experience and knowledge provided clear advantages over primitive species. The possibility that his fundamental assumptions were wrong challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. Arrange the meeting, he decided. But maintain full defensive protocols. This could be an attempt to gather intelligence about our command structure. 2 days later, Zethkar found himself in the diplomatic bay of the Eternal Dominion, waiting for the first face-to-face encounter with human representatives. The chamber had been configured for atmospheric conditions suitable to human physiology, though extensive security measures ensured that any attempt at biological warfare or covert operations would be immediately detected. When the human delegation arrived, Zethkar was struck by how unremarkable they appeared. 3 individuals in simple environmental suits, showing no visible signs of enhancement or augmentation. They looked exactly like the primitive species he had expected to encounter at the beginning of this campaign. "Commander Zethkar," the lead human spoke through universal translators, "I am Dr. Sarah Chen, representing the Human Collective Council. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." The formal courtesy was unexpected. Most species under military pressure either approached negotiations with desperate pleading or defiant hostility. The humans displayed neither emotion, instead maintaining the kind of professional demeanor typically associated with routine diplomatic exchanges. "Dr. Chen," Zethkar replied, "your people have engaged in sustained military resistance against overwhelming force. I assume you're here to discuss surrender terms." "Actually, we're here to prevent a catastrophic misunderstanding that could damage both our civilizations," Dr. Chen replied. "We believe you've been operating under incorrect assumptions about human capabilities and objectives." Zethkar felt his defensive instincts activate. The suggestion that he had misunderstood the situation was precisely the kind of psychological manipulation he had been trained to recognize and counter. "Enlighten me," he said. "You've been treating this conflict as if it were a conventional territorial expansion campaign," Dr. Chen explained. "But, from our perspective, this has been a first contact protocol with an established galactic civilization. We've been trying to demonstrate our capabilities and assess yours in order to establish appropriate diplomatic relationships." The statement was so far outside Zethkar's frame of reference that he initially struggled to process its implications. The humans were claiming that their military resistance had been intended as a form of diplomatic communication rather than actual warfare. "You've been conducting diplomatic communication by destroying our ships?" he asked. "We've been responding to military aggression with measured defensive actions while simultaneously gathering the information necessary to establish productive long-term relationships," Dr. Chen replied. "From our analysis, your civilization appears to expand through military intimidation followed by integration of conquered species. We wanted to demonstrate that such an approach would be ineffective with humans while simultaneously showing that we could be valuable allies rather than subjects." Zethkar found himself completely outside his area of expertise. Nothing in 3 centuries of military experience had prepared him for negotiations with a species that claimed to view warfare as a form of diplomatic introduction. "What information have you gathered?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be disturbing. "Complete tactical and strategic profiles of hegemony, military doctrine, detailed assessments of technological capabilities, comprehensive analysis of political and administrative structures, and preliminary understanding of the economic systems that support your galactic civilization," Dr. Chen replied matter-of-factly. The casual way she listed information that should have been impossible for any external force to acquire sent chills through Zethkar's body. If the humans possessed such comprehensive intelligence about hegemony operations, they represented a security threat unlike anything in galactic history. "How did you acquire such information?" he asked. "Every military encounter with your forces provided additional data about capabilities, doctrine, and strategic priorities," Dr. Chen explained. "Your siege of Earth has been particularly valuable for understanding hegemony approaches to sustained operations. The coordination required to maintain orbital blockade revealed significant details about your logistics and command structures." Zethkar realized with growing horror that the humans had been using hegemony attacks as intelligence-gathering opportunities. Every tactical victory had actually been contributing to eventual human advantages by providing them with detailed knowledge of hegemony capabilities. Additionally, Dr. Chen continued, "Our distributed monitoring network throughout the galaxy has allowed us to observe hegemony operations in other sectors. We've developed comprehensive understanding of how your civilization manages territorial expansion, client-species relationships, and internal security." The mention of a distributed monitoring network throughout the galaxy hit Zethkar like a physical blow. The humans were claiming to have established intelligence capabilities across the entire hegemony sphere of influence without detection. Such a network would represent the most sophisticated espionage operation in galactic history. "That's impossible," he said. "Our security protocols would detect any human intelligence operations. Our monitoring systems don't rely on technology your security protocols are designed to detect," Dr. Chen replied. "We've developed observation methods that operate below the threshold of conventional detection systems." Zethkar began to understand why Grand Admiral Vexthra had authorized emergency measures. If the humans possessed undetectable intelligence capabilities throughout hegemony space, they could potentially coordinate uprisings, share strategic information with client species, or conduct sabotage operations without any possibility of prevention or retaliation. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. "We want to establish formal diplomatic relationships based on mutual respect and shared benefits," Dr. Chen replied. "Humans have no interest in territorial expansion or military conquest. We prefer cooperation and knowledge exchange with other civilizations." The offer sounded reasonable, but Zethkar couldn't ignore the implications of everything he had learned about human capabilities. A species that could gather intelligence throughout the galaxy, coordinate operations across impossible distances, and develop technologies superior to hegemony systems represented a potential threat to the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. "What assurances can you provide that human capabilities won't be used against hegemony interests?" he asked. "The same assurances you would provide that hegemony capabilities won't be used against human interests," Dr. Chen replied. "Mutual agreements based on clearly defined boundaries and shared objectives." It was a perfectly logical response that completely failed to address Sethkar's fundamental concerns. The humans were suggesting negotiations between equals, but the balance of capabilities was too unclear for him to assess whether such equality actually existed. "I'll need to consult with higher authorities," he said. "Of course," Dr. Chen replied. "However, there's one additional piece of information you should be aware of before making any decisions about future operations." Sethkar felt his apprehension spike. Every additional piece of information about human capabilities had been more disturbing than the last. "What information?" he asked. "The conflict you've been conducting with human colonies represents approximately 2% of total human military capability," Dr. Chen explained calmly. "The vast majority of our civilization has been focused on activities you haven't yet detected." The statement hit Sethkar with the force of complete paradigm collapse. If the resistance that had required 15,000 hegemony ships to address represented only 2% of human capabilities, then the total scope of human civilization was beyond anything he could comprehend. "What activities?" he asked. "Primarily exploration and development in regions of the galaxy that aren't currently occupied by established civilizations," Dr. Chen replied. "We've been expanding into uninhabited systems while simultaneously studying the established galactic community to understand appropriate protocols for interaction." Sethkar realized that his entire understanding of the strategic situation had been based on completely incorrect assumptions. The humans weren't a primitive species defending their limited territory against superior force. They were an advanced civilization that had been studying galactic society while simultaneously expanding into regions the established powers hadn't even explored. "How long have you been observing galactic civilization?" he asked. "Approximately 200 years, Dr. Chen replied. We wanted to understand the social, political, and economic structures that govern interspecies relationships before initiating formal contact." 200 years of covert observation explained how the humans had developed such sophisticated understanding of hegemony operations. They had been studying galactic civilization longer than many species had been members of it. "Why initiate contact now?" Sethkar asked. "Because your expansion into human space forced the issue," Dr. Chen explained. "We had been planning to initiate formal diplomatic contact within the next few decades, but your military operations required us to accelerate that timeline." As the full scope of human preparation and capability became clear, Sethkar realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare, diplomacy, and galactic civilization had been based on incomplete understanding of what was actually possible. The humans hadn't been fighting a desperate defensive war, they had been conducting a controlled demonstration of their capabilities while simultaneously gathering the information necessary to establish relationships with established galactic powers. The thought that terrified him most was the realization that if the humans had been preparing for formal contact for 200 years, they had undoubtedly developed protocols and strategies that accounted for every possible response the hegemony might make. This wasn't first contact with a primitive species, it was a carefully orchestrated revelation by a civilization that had been studying and preparing for this moment longer than most galactic empires had existed. And if Dr. Chen was correct about the scope of human capabilities, then the hegemony was about to discover that their position as the dominant galactic power had been based on the illusion that they understood the true extent of civilization in their own galaxy. Commander Sethkar stood in the grand chamber of the Hegemony High Council, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy. 3 months had passed since his meeting with Dr. Sarah Chen, and the reverberations of that conversation had shaken the foundations of galactic civilization. What had begun as a routine expansion campaign had evolved into the most significant diplomatic crisis in hegemony history. "Commander," Grand Admiral Vexthra's voice carried the weight of authority accumulated over millennia, "present your final assessment of the human situation." Sethkar activated the holographic display that would show the Council everything he had learned about humanity over the past year. The data was staggering in scope and implications, representing a complete revision of everything the hegemony thought it knew about the galaxy they ruled. "Honored Council," he began, "I must report that our initial intelligence assessments were not merely inaccurate, they were fundamentally wrong about the nature of what we were confronting." The first image showed the revised map of human space. Where intelligence had originally indicated dozens of primitive colonies, the display now revealed thousands of settlements spanning nearly a quarter of the galaxy. Hidden cities in asteroid belts, underground civilizations on barren worlds, and massive orbital habitats disguised as natural phenomena. Human civilization encompasses approximately 40,000 star systems, Sethkar continued. Their total population exceeds 800 billion individuals, supported by technological infrastructure that rivals or surpasses our own in several key areas. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the council chamber. The idea that such a vast civilization could have existed without hegemony knowledge challenged basic assumptions about their intelligence capabilities and galactic oversight. How could such expansion have remained undetected? Asked Council Member Thexnara, her crystalline features shifting to display skepticism. Human development followed patterns specifically designed to avoid detection by established galactic powers, Zethkar explained. They studied our exploration methods, territorial markers, and monitoring systems for over 2 centuries before beginning their expansion. Every human settlement was positioned and constructed to fall below the thresholds that would trigger our attention. The next series of images showed examples of human concealment technology. Asteroid mining operations that appeared to be natural formations. Underground cities with surface camouflage so sophisticated that orbital surveys detected only lifeless worlds. Space habitats constructed within nebulae and cosmic dust clouds that rendered them invisible to standard sensors. Their concealment capabilities represent technological innovations we hadn't considered possible, Zethkar continued. They haven't simply avoided our detection, they've created entirely new categories of covert development that our monitoring systems weren't designed to identify. What about their military capabilities? Demanded War Council Chief Mordek. Surely their weapons technology can't match millennia of hegemony development. Zethkar activated the combat analysis displays with reluctance. The data would be difficult for the Council to accept, but the evidence was undeniable. Human military technology demonstrates several fundamental advantages over our own systems, he reported. Their faster-than-light travel is approximately 40% more efficient than our best drives. Their weapons can penetrate our strongest shields through novel approaches to energy manipulation that our physics teams are still trying to understand. Most significantly, their coordination capabilities appear to operate through non-technological means that allow instantaneous communication across galactic distances. The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Superior technology had been the foundation of hegemony dominance for thousands of years. The suggestion that a previously unknown species possessed capabilities beyond hegemony achievements challenged the fundamental basis of their galactic authority. Explain their coordination methods, ordered Council Member ZYX Tal, her tentacles writhing with anxiety. Our best analysis suggests that humans have developed collective consciousness capabilities that transcend individual identity, Zethkar replied. They appear to share information, experiences, and decision-making processes through biological or quantum mechanisms that don't rely on detectable technology. This allows them to coordinate activities across impossible distances and react to changing situations as if their entire civilization were a single organism. The concept was so far outside established understanding of consciousness and identity that several council members struggled visibly to process the implications. If humans could truly function as a collective intelligence spanning galactic distances, they represented something entirely beyond previous hegemony experience. What are their intentions toward the hegemony? Asked Grand Admiral Vexthra. According to their diplomatic representatives, humans have no interest in territorial conquest or political domination, Zethkar replied. They claim to prefer collaborative relationships based on mutual benefit and knowledge exchange. And you believe these claims? Council Member Thexnara asked skeptically. Their actions support their stated intentions, Zethkar admitted. Throughout our conflict, humans consistently chose tactics designed to minimize casualties while maximizing intelligence gathering. Even when they possessed clear advantages, they chose negotiation over military victory. Their behavior suggests long-term strategic thinking focused on coexistence rather than conquest. Grand Admiral Vexthra leaned forward in her command throne, her ancient features displaying the kind of concern that came from millennia of experience with galactic threats. Commander, in your professional opinion, could the hegemony defeat humanity in a total war scenario? The question that Zethkar had been dreading had finally been asked directly. He had spent months analyzing human capabilities and running strategic simulations, hoping to find some scenario where hegemony advantages could overcome human innovations. The results had been consistently discouraging. No, he replied simply. Human technological advantages, coordination capabilities, and strategic preparation make military victory impossible through conventional means. Any attempt at total war would result in hegemony defeat and likely galactic destabilization. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence for everything the Council had believed about their position in the galaxy. For the first time in hegemony history, they were facing an opponent they could not defeat through military force. "What alternatives do we have?" asked War Council Chief Mordek. "Diplomacy," Zethkar replied. "Humans have consistently demonstrated willingness to negotiate collaborative relationships. They possess capabilities we need, and we possess resources they value. The foundation for mutually beneficial arrangements exists." "What do humans want from us?" Grand Admiral Vexthra asked. "Access to our historical databases, cultural exchanges with client species, and formal recognition as an independent galactic power," Zethkar replied. "They're particularly interested in our records of extinct civilizations and our understanding of galactic history spanning millions of years." The requests were surprisingly modest given human capabilities. Most species with such overwhelming advantages would demand territorial concessions or political submission. The fact that humans were primarily interested in knowledge and cultural exchange suggested genuine commitment to their stated preference for cooperation over conquest. "What would they offer in return?" Council member ZYXTAL asked. "Technological innovations that could revolutionize hegemony infrastructure, medical advances that could extend the lifespans of member species, and collaborative exploration of regions beyond current galactic borders," Zethkar replied. They've also indicated willingness to assist with long-standing problems like the quantum storms in the Veil sector and the mysterious energy readings from the galactic core. The offers represented solutions to challenges that had persisted for millennia despite the best efforts of hegemony science. If humans could deliver on such promises, the benefits would far outweigh any loss of exclusive galactic dominance. "There's one additional consideration," Zethkar continued. "Our conflict with humanity has already begun to destabilize existing power structures throughout the galaxy. Client species are questioning hegemony authority, independent civilizations are establishing direct contact with humans, and several member states have requested explanations for our inability to resolve the situation through traditional means." Grand Admiral Vexthra nodded grimly. The intelligence reports had been clear about the broader implications of the human situation. Continued conflict would likely result in the collapse of hegemony authority even if military victory were possible. "Commander," she said finally, "you've convinced us that military solutions are not viable. What specific diplomatic arrangements would you recommend?" Zethkar had been preparing for this question throughout the months of analysis and negotiation. The answer would reshape galactic civilization in ways that no one could fully predict. Formal recognition of humanity as an equal galactic power, establishment of cultural and technological exchange programs, and collaborative development of protocols for interaction with civilizations beyond our current sphere of influence, he replied. Essentially, transformation of the hegemony from a dominant empire into a confederation of equal partners. The proposal represented the end of hegemony supremacy as it had existed for millennia. But, given human capabilities and intentions, it also offered the possibility of a galactic civilization more prosperous and stable than anything that had existed before. "The age of expansion through conquest is ending," Zethkar concluded. "Humanity has demonstrated that sufficiently advanced civilizations can develop beyond the reach of traditional military solutions. Our choice is to adapt to this new reality or face the collapse of everything we've built." As the Council debated the most significant decision in galactic history, Zethkar reflected on how completely his understanding of warfare had been transformed. He had begun this campaign believing that overwhelming force could resolve any conflict. Now he understood that true strategic superiority came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the wisdom to recognize when former enemies could become valuable allies. 6 months later, Commander Zethkar stood in the same diplomatic bay where he had first met Dr. Sarah Chan, but the circumstances had changed completely. Instead of a negotiation between victor and vanquished, this was a ceremony marking the establishment of the Galactic Confederation, a partnership between equals that would govern interspecies relationships throughout the galaxy. "Commander, Dr. Chen approached with a smile that conveyed genuine warmth. "I understand you'll be serving as the first hegemony representative to the Joint Coordination Council." "It seems appropriate," Zethkar replied. "I've learned more about the possibilities of cooperation than anyone else in hegemony leadership." "You've also learned that warfare itself can be transformed into something productive rather than destructive," Dr. Chen observed. "That kind of understanding will be valuable as we work together to explore regions beyond our current borders." As Zethkar looked out at the stars through the diplomatic bay's viewing ports, he realized that his education in the true nature of warfare was just beginning. Humanity had taught him that conflict could be a tool for learning rather than destruction, that strength could be demonstrated through restraint rather than aggression, and that the greatest victories came from transforming enemies into allies. But, most importantly, they had shown him that the galaxy was far larger and more complex than any single civilization could understand alone. The future would require cooperation between species with different strengths, different perspectives, and different approaches to the challenges that lay ahead. The war was over, but the real work of building a galactic civilization worthy of the universe they inhabited was just beginning. And, for the first time in his long military career, Commander Zethkar looked forward to discovering what lay beyond the horizon of his understanding.